The year is 793. The sun rises over Lindisfarne, a small island off the northeastern coast of England. Monks begin their morning prayers in the monastery, their voices echoing through stone halls that have stood for over a century. By nightfall, those same halls will run red with blood, and the word Viking will become synonymous with terror across medieval Europe. But here's what history books won't always tell you. These weren't the noble warriors of legend, the honorable shield-bearers we see in modern television shows. They were raiders, slavers, and opportunists who capitalized on the chaos of a fractured continent. And yet, calling them simply brutal savages misses the point entirely. The truth about the Vikings is far more complex, far more fascinating, and yes, far more brutal than popular culture wants you to believe. Welcome to Neural Battlefields, where we decode the past to understand the present. Today, we're stripping away the romanticism and examining the Viking Age for what it really was. A 300-year period of expansion, exploitation, and transformation that reshaped the face of Europe. Let's start with that raid on Lindisfarne because it marked the beginning of an era that would haunt Europe for generations. The monastery at Lindisfarne wasn't chosen randomly. These monks had accumulated wealth, precious metals, illuminated manuscripts, and religious artifacts. More importantly, they were defenseless. The concept of a standing army protecting religious sites was virtually non-existent in 8th century England. The Vikings knew this. When those longships appeared on the horizon, the monks had no idea what was coming. The Norsemen weren't there to negotiate or trade. They came with axes, swords, and a singular purpose: take everything of value. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, one of our primary sources for this period, describes the attack in terms that still chill the blood over 1,000 years later. The heathens poured out the blood of saints around the altar and trampled on the bodies of saints in the temple of God, like dung in the streets. This wasn't warfare as medieval Europe understood it. There were no declarations, no formal battles between armies, no codes of chivalry. The Vikings had identified a vulnerability in the European coastline and exploited it with ruthless efficiency. And here's the thing that made them truly terrifying: they were just getting started. Over the next 3 centuries, Viking raiders would strike targets from Iceland to Constantinople, from the rivers of Russia to the shores of North Africa. They established kingdoms in Ireland, conquered significant portions of England, and founded what would become the Duchy of Normandy in France. Their reach was staggering, their impact immeasurable, but let's be clear about their methods. The Viking economy was built substantially on slavery. When those longships returned home, they weren't just loaded with gold and silver. They carried human cargo, captives torn from their homes to be sold in markets across Scandinavia and beyond. Recent archaeological evidence and analysis of historical sources suggest that slavery was fundamental to Viking society, not incidental. Thralls, as they were called, made up a significant portion of the Norse population, perhaps as much as 25% in some regions. These weren't prisoners of war in the medieval sense. They were farmers, children, monks, craftsmen, anyone unfortunate enough to be in the wrong place when the Norsemen came calling. The genetic legacy of this practice can still be traced today. Studies of Icelandic DNA reveal a striking pattern. The male lineage is predominantly Scandinavian, while the female lineage shows significant Celtic and British origins. The implication is stark and uncomfortable. Viking men took women from raided territories, willingly or otherwise. But here's where our understanding needs to become more nuanced. Calling the Vikings unique in their brutality would be dishonest. Medieval Europe was not a gentle place. Christian armies committed atrocities regularly. Charlemagne, celebrated as a founder of European civilization, massacred thousands of Saxons who refused to convert to Christianity just years before Lindisfarne. The Byzantines were no strangers to cruelty. The Islamic caliphates that ruled much of the Mediterranean engaged in similar practices of raiding and slavery. What made the Vikings stand out wasn't that they were more brutal, It was that they were different. They came from outside the established order, they worshipped different gods, and they didn't play by the rules of European warfare that had been developing since the Roman era. To the monks writing the chronicles, to the kings trying to defend their realms, the Vikings represented chaos incarnate. Let's talk about their military effectiveness, because this is where the Vikings truly earned their fearsome reputation. The longship was a masterpiece of medieval engineering. Shallow drafted enough to navigate rivers, sturdy enough to cross the North Atlantic, fast enough to outrun most pursuers. These vessels gave the Vikings a strategic mobility that no other European force could match. They could strike deep inland, following rivers into the heart of kingdoms, then disappear before any organized response could be mounted. The Great Heathen Army that invaded England in 865 demonstrated this advantage perfectly. This wasn't a raiding party. This was a full-scale invasion force, possibly numbering in the thousands, led by sons of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, if we're to believe the sagas. They conquered East Anglia, Northumbria, and Mercia, 3 of the 4 major Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Only Wessex under Alfred the Great managed to resist them, and even then just barely. But the Vikings weren't mindless warriors. They were strategic thinkers who understood leverage. When they captured York in 866, they didn't just ransack the city. They established a kingdom, Jorvik, that would last for nearly a century. They minted coins, established trade networks, and integrated themselves into the existing power structures. This pattern repeated across their conquered territories. The Viking settlements in Ireland became major trading hubs. The Rus Vikings, who pushed into Eastern Europe, established the foundations of what would become Russia itself. The siege warfare tactics they employed showed sophisticated military thinking. At Paris in 885, a Viking force laid siege to the city for nearly a year. They built siege towers, attempted to fill in moats, and negotiated with both the defenders and the Frankish king. When Charles the Fat finally paid them off with 700 pounds of silver, it wasn't because the Vikings couldn't have taken the city. It was because they'd made a calculated decision that payment was preferable to the casualties they'd suffer in an assault. This brings us to something crucial that the romantic versions of Viking history often get wrong. These weren't honor-bound warriors seeking glorious death in battle. They were pragmatists. Yes, they valued courage and martial prowess, but they valued success more. A Viking who returned home rich from raiding was far more celebrated than one who died heroically with nothing to show for it. The sagas, those Icelandic texts written down in the 13th and 14th centuries, have done tremendous damage to our understanding of actual Viking culture. These were literary works, written by Christian authors centuries after the Viking Age ended, often with political or social agendas. They present a romanticized, heroic view of the Norse past that serves narrative purposes, not historical accuracy. The real Vikings were more concerned with profit than prophecy, with practicality than mythology. Take the famous Viking berserkers, warriors supposedly able to work themselves into a frenzy that made them impervious to pain. Modern historians debate whether these even existed as described, or whether they were literary inventions. If they did exist, they were likely rare individuals, possibly consuming psychoactive substances, not the common infantry the popular imagination suggests. Most Viking warriors were farmers by trade, men who picked up weapons seasonally when raids were planned or when their lord called them to war. The religious practices of the pre-Christian Vikings have been similarly romanticized. Yes, they worshipped gods like Odin, Thor, and Freya. But Norse paganism wasn't the organized religion with clear doctrines that modern media often portrays. It was a collection of regional practices, myths, and traditions that varied significantly across Scandinavia. When the Vikings began converting to Christianity, starting in earnest in the 10th century, many did so for political and economic reasons as much as spiritual ones. Christian kingdoms were more willing to trade with and marry into Christian Viking dynasties. This conversion process itself reveals something about Viking culture that contradicts the fierce pagan warrior stereotype. They were adaptable, willing to change fundamental aspects of their society when it proved advantageous. By the end of the 11th century, Scandinavia was firmly Christian, and the Viking Age was effectively over. The descendants of those raiders were now European kings, following the same cultural norms as the kingdoms their ancestors had terrorized. The genetic and cultural legacy they left behind is staggering. The Normans, who conquered England in 1066, were descendants of Vikings who had settled in France. The Kingdom of Sicily was ruled by Norman Vikings who had pushed south into the Mediterranean. The medieval Russian states traced their origins to Scandinavian traders and warriors who had established themselves along river routes. Iceland and Greenland were colonized by Norwegian Vikings, with a brief settlement even attempted in North America, centuries before Columbus. But let's not lose sight of the human cost. For every Viking success story, there were dozens of communities destroyed, thousands of lives ended or enslaved. The monasteries that preserved much of classical learning were prime targets, and countless manuscripts were lost to Viking raids. The economic development of coastal regions was stunted for generations because settlement patterns shifted inland, away from the vulnerable shores. The political instability caused by constant raiding contributed to the fragmentation of kingdoms and the chaos that characterized much of the early medieval period. The transformation of the Vikings from raiders to settlers to integrated European powers happened gradually. As they established kingdoms and converted to Christianity, they became part of the very system they had once terrorized. The last great Viking invasion was in 1066, when Harald Hardrada of Norway attempted to conquer England, only to be defeated at Stamford Bridge by Harold Godwinson, whose own kingdom would fall to William the Conqueror, himself of Viking descent, just weeks later. So what's the truth about the Vikings? They were neither the noble warriors of saga and screen, nor simply savage raiders. They were people responding to circumstances, opportunities, and limitations in ways that made sense within their cultural context. They valued family, loyalty, and wealth. They were skilled craftsmen, poets, and explorers. They were also raiders, slavers, and conquerors who inflicted tremendous suffering across Europe. The brutality they're famous for wasn't unique to them, but it was real. The romantic versions of Viking history that dominate popular culture do a disservice to the actual complexity of these people and this era. Understanding the Vikings requires holding two truths simultaneously. They were remarkable in their achievements and devastating in their impact. The archaeological evidence continues to reshape our understanding. Recent excavations have revealed Viking trading networks that stretch to Central Asia. We've found evidence of Viking women warriors, though likely far rarer than recent media suggests. We've discovered that Viking settlements were more diverse than previously thought, with significant integration of local populations. DNA studies are revealing migration patterns and social structures that complicate the simple raider narrative. But we must resist the temptation to sanitize this history. The Viking Age was built on violence, exploitation, and the suffering of countless individuals whose names we'll never know. The thralls who built Viking prosperity, the monks murdered at their altars, the communities destroyed and scattered, they're part of this story too. Acknowledging the achievements of Viking culture doesn't require ignoring or minimizing the harm they caused. The fascination with Vikings in modern culture reflects something deeper than just an interest in history. We're drawn to stories of individuals and small groups who challenged massive empires, who explored unknown waters, who built something lasting despite overwhelming odds. That's a powerful narrative. But it's important to remember that for those on the receiving end of Viking expansion, these weren't heroes. They were invaders, no different in their impact than any other conquering force in history. As we close this examination of the Viking Age, we're left with a picture far more complex than either the heroic sagas or the terrified Christian chronicles suggest. The Vikings were products of their time and place, responding to opportunities with the tools and values available to them. They changed Europe irrevocably, for better and worse. Their legacy lives on in languages, genetic heritage, place names, and political boundaries that still exist today. The brutal truth about the Vikings is that there is no single truth. They were explorers and slavers, craftsmen and killers, poets and pirates. They built lasting kingdoms and left behind ruins. They were, in short, human, with all the complexity, contradiction, and capacity for both creation and destruction that implies. Understanding them requires moving beyond romanticism without falling into simplistic condemnation, acknowledging their impact without excusing their crimes, and recognizing their achievements without forgetting their victims. That's the Viking Age, 3 centuries that reshaped a continent, told through blood and silver, saga and chronicle, archaeology and DNA. Not the legend but the reality, not the romance but the truth. If this deep dive into the often misunderstood realities of history resonated with you, consider subscribing to Neural Battlefields. We're committed to examining the past with honesty and nuance, cutting through the myths to find the complex truths beneath. Hit that like button if you appreciate history that doesn't shy away from difficult questions, and share this with anyone who's ready to see beyond the Hollywood version of the Viking Age. There's so much more to explore, so many more battles to decode, and we're just getting started. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep challenging the narratives you've been told.